So thank you for coming. My name is Joshua Chris. I'm from Unified Platform, which is a US Cyber Command system of record from the DoD, and I am the CISO for our program. Do all the cyber lead and everything to do with risk management of our software and our environments.
Good afternoon, or good morning. Is it afternoon or morning yet? Morning, okay. Feels like afternoon. I feel like I've been up all day. My name is Scott Hissam. I'm a senior member of the technical staff at the Software Engineering Institute, owned and operated by Carnegie Mellon. Been with them for 27 years, and now for the last almost 4 years now, I've been embedded working with CoCo. CoCo, by the way, that's his call sign here. But I've been working with CoCo now for the last 4 years in software assurance, which led me into supply chain risk management, which we're here to talk about, and how we're actually dealing with that with open source software. That's a legally binding slide, but you don't need to worry about that. So. If you want to read it, it's in the attached slide deck for the presentation. But really, what this work is about was trying to find a way to look at open source software with the lenses that the Department of Defense and its acquisition activities do with proprietary software. This has really been brought about by two big events which occurred in 2021, roughly, which was the executive order from the President of the United States, Executive Order 028, talking about securing the nation's software. One final outcome of that was an OMB memo in late in 22, which really called for government acquisition activities like the one that we represent here at Unified Platform, knowing that teams had to provide an attestation that they follow secure software development practices, and an attestation to that, and also software bill of materials. And then there was also another memo that came out from the DoD CIO office, which Austin Bryant and Colonel Cady talked about yesterday, which was released by the CIO's office about how to deal with open source software in the Department of Defense, not only as a consumer, but as a collaborator and a producer. Most important for us is as a consumer. And so what we did was we used these memos as a basis for forming criteria to which we would apply to open source software. And we would use the technique that we're going to be showing you here in a little bit to use data sources from public open source data sources and open source software tools to support our software approval process and our software assurance process. And so that's what we're here to talk about, and how we do that and what that looks like.
All right, so to talk a little bit about, as I'm a CISO, from the DoD standpoint, I have to look at risk, and I have to assess all the applications and software that are coming through my pipelines. From the DoD, I don't want to say vet vendors, right? But we look at vendors and we say, what is the risk of this running in my environment or my system? So as Scott was saying with the memos that came out, one of the things we wanted to do, we look at, here's on the left side, you see kind of an idea of what I have to go through on a vendor vetting for a known vendor. And this could be, just for an example, something like Splunk or any other type of product like that. A known product, not a project, but a product. And the question started to come, well, how do we vet the vendors now from an acquisition intel standpoint? What do we see in those type of reports? What is the market research that we're getting from those? And then what I started to ask the team about 3 years ago, I think, was more on the lines of, what are the gaps for open source software? Because I was seeing these open source software come in and they were like, we want to use this. And how do I vet that? How do I know that this is something that my risk tolerance is okay with? And so luckily, I will say this, luckily, a member of my team actually was a guy who had been doing open source before they called it open source and it was cool, Scott Hissam. And honestly, Scott literally, I found this out later, wrote the book on it. 2 of them, actually.
Wow.
So,
yeah, I haven't really retired on them yet.
So, but one of the things we wanted to look at is like those things, they had to meet our sustainability for our CATO and what we call a CTF, which is certificates filled. So every application has to go through a process, and it has to meet a certain criteria or a certain risk threshold for us to be able to take it into our environments. It had to pass the software assurance providence walks, and it had to meet leadership's expectations at our technical oversight committees. So that was the gaps that we were trying to answer from open source software.
Yeah, I think the presentation that we saw from Catherine this morning talked about if you're going to consume and use open source software, there were 5 or 6 techniques that she wanted you to look at. And I wish I had her slide. I wish I could use that one instead of what I wanted to say. I think she said it more eloquently. But I think you'll see that we were doing the same thing at the same level. And I think the biggest challenge in this was that, yes, in proprietary software, you can think of your vendor as a supplier. But in open source software, and I'm going to sort of tip my hat to David Wheeler, who put a blog out about how can you do supply chain risk management when in open source when their word supplier doesn't really apply to the open source software community. And I think Catherine said it too. They don't owe us anything, right? They provide. I think that's the word David liked to use, a provider. And I think of them more of a source, the way you would, well, they talked about lots of liquid today. But sources, you know, like a river's a source. So that's how I kind of think about it. So what we did was we looked at the memo from the DoD, the CIO memo, and we looked at some of some of the criteria that were really being pulled out. And we abstracted that in the 6 criteria that are along the y-axis of that table. You know, we had to understand long-term. Is there long-term support? Long-term support meaning, from Catherine's description, that it's being maintained, right? You have to grok your dependencies. Understand what security is being done within the product and within the project. The integrity, are there malicious actors within that supply chain? And is the product in itself suitable for a DoD environment? And you'll see a little bit more of what we mean by that as we move through this presentation. But as we started thinking about this, we had a number of workshops from 2021 through 2022, and some of those are actually referenced in the references here in these slides, with a lot of the foundations. And we pulled together groups from the Linux Foundation, OpenSSF, Eclipse, Apache, and a lot of other folks that we worked through different OSPOs to get them together to talk about this topic. And what ended up coming out of that, through no attribution, was this idea of, yes, when we first talked about this, and I talked about this with CoCo, it was always about, well, we're going to use this open source software product. How many vulnerabilities in it? And that's a fair question. That's the product column, right? But then I said, well, are we worried about? Look at the memo. What about the project? How does it do its stuff? How is it maintained? How does it operate? What are the things that they put into place for protection to protect the security or the integrity of the product? And so the 4 Ps in the OSSP4R framework is really supposed to elicit those in the community that are trying to solve this problem to just think beyond the product, but you need to think about the project itself that maintains it, what protections they have in place, and what do they do with respect to, well, she called it governance or policy, licensing, for example. And so what we've done now is we've put together a set of tools in a minimum viable product. It's a simple little script, but it enacts a whole bunch of different interfaces on a bunch of different, from a lot of different public and some proprietary data sources, and I'll explain that. And we try to populate indicators and metrics in that table to give that view to our teams. And once this particular page is we instantiated this specifically for our stakeholder and our needs, but the framework is supposed to think a little bit beyond that and could be done at other different levels. But I think the 4 Ps still exist. It forces you to think outside just the product.
All right, so as we got into the matrix, we started to utilize a couple of different, at first, Scott and the team brought Scorecard and the critical score from OSSF. We took that information in and then started doing a little more discovery as well. We realized MITRE actually has an open source called Hipcheck that does some of the same, but then also has some extra checks that we could get. And then we found there were 3 or 4 different proprietaries as well that we could pull in from their API some of the information that we wanted to see in some of the checks, or what we called flags. In our vendor reports, we had about 85, 90 different flags that we could see from those. And so we tried to, I don't want to say mirror, but tried to at least see the same type of information for open source projects and pull those 4 Ps in that instance. So what the script that we built and the information here actually correlates all of those flags into an actual report and publishes it via, right now we just published it to Confluence to make it easy. Right. But I'm sure someone could probably take it even further and make it into a dashboard or whatever. But that is what we did to take this, is we actually took this and said, okay, product team that was requesting to use this, and I'll give you an example. We were going to build an API gateway, and we had 6 different things from open source that they said, hey, we would like to utilize one of these 6, right? So we went and ran this report against it, and we said, okay, here's the ones that we feel that we can automatically eliminate based on dependencies, based on a couple of other flags that we saw. And then we could actually take it to our leadership and said, here are the 2 or 3 that we think we should push forward on. And we should pick one of these solutions. So it's the risk recommendation that I can give to my program based on the reporting and based on all the information that this gives. And that can actually set into what the mitigation plan and what the actual risk of that is.
So, and then I think the only thing I want to say is that this initial step, when you're first vetting that first suite that's coming in, it's a bit human intensive. I think Bruce, was that one of the speakers, says you want to automate as much as possible, but until you can do it on paper, you really can't automate it. And so we've automated as much as we can, but we still have a little bit of human in the loop to make sure that our thresholds for red flags is appropriate for the context in which this application or this open source software component is going to be used. We think context means everything. But once we understand that context of use and we've got that baseline, now we can start treating it like its own threshold. And now we can actually run these reports automated at a frequency that's cost effective. It costs money to run things in the cloud for existence, right? But once we've baselined them, then we can run these things either on a periodic basis or an event basis and watch for changes over time. So if anything changes within the project's ecosystem, right? If maybe their developers have dropped off, maybe the project's gone abandoned. I could think of a lot of reasons why you might want to reassess using a particular component based on what changes over time. So this is what a report looks like. It is not glitzy, and I have to take the blame for that because I cannot stand user interfaces. I can't write them, I can't do them, I hate them. But this is the best I could do to convey the information. And so what we're trying to do, I'm really good at backends. I like backends a lot. But everything's a JSON here. And so basically the views that we're seeing here, the first 2 views, remember that table I showed a few slides ago? Well, the top set of colors is really all those scores from all the sub-tools that are being used rolled up into that P4 look and feel. the next row of colors is those same numbers now rolled up to the stakeholder criteria. And what I discovered in doing this, when I fed this back to the team and the product teams, nobody cares about the first set of numbers, the first tables. That doesn't mean much. But when you line it to the stakeholder criteria, they really care about that, and that helps a lot. Once you see those tables, the colors are not supposed to indicate badness. It's supposed to direct your eye and say, I need to go tend to some things that look like they're not hitting the thresholds they're supposed to be hitting. And then that's when the next set of tables come in. And what we show is the details of the native checks that are being done by the open source tools that we're actually using. And so all we're doing here is showing roll-ups, summaries from Scorecard, summaries from Hipcheck. And I'll show you some of these. And then once you have those, yeah, go ahead. Then what you can do is from any one of them, you can sort of trace from I'm trying to do this statically, but it's all on one Confluence page, but you can see which red flags are contributing to the bad scores, the red scores, for example. And just because a score is red, it just means it's tripped a threshold. It doesn't mean it's really bad. That's what the product teams, they have to get involved and tell us, is that a true red flag or are our thresholds too sensitive? And then as we then drill from, and here you can see my checks is ones that we are natively doing. We want to, for instance, some of the projects that have been proposed in the past were actually identified as a forked project. Well, one of the things in the DoD CIO memo is they recommend don't use forked projects. So for right now, until a team convinces me why we need to use a forked project, we're going to red flag that and say that's something that I want to know why. We do look for restrictive licenses. These are licenses which are not necessarily conducive to a DoD environment. So if we're going to be making changes, and we may not, we don't want to be compelled to release code if it's not necessary. There are reasons for that. And then you can see the scorecard checks. We've sort of taken the scorecard checks and aligned them under those different columns of the P4 table. Hipcheck, we see some of theirs here as well. And the one at the bottom I want to explain now is a company, it's called Phylum. Phylum was one of the CyBER projects that were actually, they went through the Air Force to get that, right? Yeah, and so we have access and can use that product, and they look at, they're helpful for us in our ability to dependency walk everything. Oh yeah, right. So then as we continue to go through, we begin to see more and more. Then we can go, once we go from we see the code reviews. Why is that red flagged? Well, then I'm actually now pulling strings out of the Hipcheck and pulling strings out of the Scorecard JSON structures and putting them here for the purpose of review and bringing those forward. Next one, please. Same thing is going on here. Oh yeah, here, let me hold this here. So here, what I want to show is that when we do this, we can start with a software bill of material for a component. So if the project is, say, Grafana, I can download the source code to Grafana. I can run SIFT on that, generate an SBOM, and then I use that SBOM, give it to Phylum. Phylum not only will start doing an analysis and from their curated database of vulnerabilities and malicious code and malicious authors, for example, but then I can use the dependencies that are identified in that SBOM and then use the Phylum API to continue going. So imagine a recursive algorithm that starts with a set of nodes and then just recursively descends that. And so here in the example here, whatever component I was looking at the moment, the dependency, I had 92 dependencies in my SBOM. But by following those dependencies, I was able to find 751 more dependencies to create the complete, what we think is the complete graph for a component. The other thing that the product teams, yeah, you can move on. The other thing that product teams can, yeah, jump past that one. The other thing product teams can do is then when they see the list of known vulnerabilities on the left and on the lower, then they can look to what are the critical and high vulnerabilities that have been identified by the phylum group that have curated these problems with recommendations and CVE numbers, so they can immediately tell us whether or not that's a false positive or not.
Yeah, we'll jump in real quick and say, for my section on that, the recommended fixes on those, a lot of times that it finds is, hey, this package is pulling like 1.0.9 and it needs to be pulling like 1.14. And it's an easy enough fix to say, hey, just point to the upgraded version on the dependency tree. So.
Yeah, so here's one. You want to talk, this is,
Yeah, and then, so one of the other examples, I gave an example about like an API gateway earlier. One of the other products we're doing for our data side of the house had a new capability. It uses 17 different open source products. So with 17 top level components, we found 22,260 primary dependencies, right? So then after Scott and the team walked the tree down, we also found there was another 51,385 dependencies down that tree. So for a total of like 73,645 actual dependencies. Now, what we could actually find and identify project-wise, and that based off like actually being able to detect the home project, was around 16,000 of those. So we could actually walk the tree and look at all 16,000 of these projects and dependencies for our main source that we want to use.
And so, and this, in fact, we collected, so between Scorecard and Hipcheck, we ran those two tools against 16,000 GitHub projects to get status of peer reviews and the kind of data that they produce. So I thought I'd start with a few examples. So my favorite thing to do is, well, here, so this is the tool, and this is the production from what was produced by running our script against the GitHub project called Scorecard. This is the results. And it's really kind of cool. A lot of green. It looks really well. Well, if I'm going to point my tool and our tool at Scorecard, what would it look like if I pointed at my tool? The one that produced this. And I am not shy. That's what it looks like on ours. It's one component. It's one bash script. It has no dependencies. And the repository is new. I just got permission to release it a few months ago. I'm in the process of, like I said, I have no test suite yet. So there's a lot of things I still need to put up here. But this is kind of example that you see. But on a more serious standpoint, one of the ones I want to show is an example from a project called, what's it called? Yeah, it's called Anywhere Auth. It's what I want to bring your attention to here, the one that we will look for, is we see from phylum, we see one that's called malicious actors. And so I can actually, in the report, drill down on those author risk, and I find out, this is curated data from phylum, that particular author has been identified by their algorithm as being a malicious author. And so what do we do about that? That's ours to investigate, but that's the information that's being provided. I also pointed it at the XZ utils. And what do I find here? This the one? Bear with me a moment. I can't. Yeah, this is the one. So when I pointed the tool at XZ utils and that GitHub site, or libzma, I got a warning about malicious code. So if I drill on malicious code, then I can see phylum's, their response to that particular example was, absolutely remove this project as a critical malicious code project. So that's an example of, after running the tool, how we can get quick insights into the things and sort of understand, with that CIO memo, how do we understand what it is we're bringing in, who's involved, what are the practices that they have, and use that for our software approval process. The rest of how much time do I got? When are we going to? 20. We're almost done, I think. So I'm going to stop for a moment. I got 4 minutes. I'm going to stop for a moment. The rest of the slides just really talk about how we align a lot of the metrics to the DoD CIO memo, and this slide shows what specific checks and analyses are used to support those stakeholder indicators or stakeholder criteria. Is there any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to know that you use open source, and now you found one of the components, on-the-shelf components, that no source code at all. How do you deal with that? Is there a way you can deal with, like, send it off to DoD? How do you go about doing that?
I'm afraid I'm not quite getting the question.
What do you mean? What do you mean by off the shelf? Like,
Any component off the shelf, meaning you can buy it commercially, or maybe somebody has that object running somewhere, but now they're not all as functional. Will you be able to continue and certify that and say?
So if I think I understand the question, it says we're pulling a piece of software off GitHub, off the shelf. It's open source, and now that. Yeah. So right now, this tool is really focused on understanding supply chain risks with respect to open source software. There's already practices and processes that are outside of this tool that are understood by the DoD on how they handle off-the-shelf components, right? Can we talk offline? It's a different topic. Well, I'd be happy to talk. There's a question in the back here. I'm going to do this one and this one and this one. So I'm going to start with you, sir.
Yeah, Bob, in relation to the LFX project by the Linux Foundation, is this something you would contribute as module?
Would this, say that last point again, because
Are you familiar with the LFX project? It's a bunch of insight tools for open source projects.
So I would like to know more about them.
Okay.
All right, because I know there are some chaos metrics I'd like to bring into this that I don't know how to get to them.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk, because I made a recommendation to George Lamb of DISA several years ago about that.
There are, yes, thank you. Ma'am?
My question is, this framework is exciting, but I'm really excited about if you were to publish the findings, right, on a regular basis. This is excellent benchmark for open source. I know it's for DoD, but this would be amazing.
Yeah.
Big sort of knowledge graph, and you can basically see each component stands very straight.
So two things. One, we're excited about it because it's an easy way for folks to understand quickly the data that's already being mined by tools like Scorecard. All right, so we're not inventing anything new here. All we're doing is collecting and rolling it up. So fancy dashboards and all that stuff would help, but it also has to run in a pipeline. That's one thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is we went through, I went through, they went through, we all went through the process with Carnegie Mellon to get all this publicly released and under open source license, and there is a GitHub site for it, as well as the framework itself, which is not source code dependent. It's an idea, and we're trying to move that in. We actually would like to see the OpenSSF take that concept and roll it forward. That's one of the things we're trying to do. Austin?
Maybe a comment and a question. I think this is great because what you really did is you took DoD policy and merged it with a bunch of stuff that's already in the community or industry,
That's right.
which I think is sorely needed because most of the problem is like communication between both parties.
Right.
I was going to ask you about open source, but you already answered my question. But what I wanted to maybe ask CoCo is like, I don't fundamentally believe, I guess, and should you do that, the process that mirrors this for vendor software is as thorough as what you just presented.
So that was actually the last point that I wanted to put towards the entire team is when I started this journey 3 years ago with Scott, I thought I knew as much about vendored actual software that I was commercial off-the-shelf buying. And I would tell you right now that with this, I actually know more about open source than I do about commercial off-the-shelf, right? And that's mainly because, that's why the government, in my opinion, is starting to want to require SBOMs for commercial, because I want to see what's under the shelf. and I want to see the open source that's there, because then I can go run these on there. Now, what I would say to the community is, and what Scott's probably trying to get at is, if every open source project, or at least the big ones, would have this type of scoring already available, they're already running this on the project, then I don't have to go run it, right? But it's already like, there's a risk score that is given to that project that says, yes, we believe that this is empowered from a risk standpoint, that even the DoD would be good with. But that's what we're trying to get the open source community to accept more, take this on and say, hey, this is something that all projects should be doing.
If you're in the talk that I gave for Carol yesterday, I wanted new words from buyer beware, caveat emptor. Someone gave me the words, sign emptor, like science emptor. Signs emptor means buyer aware. I want to move the open source software consumer community from being buyer beware to buyer aware. And if you can make that happen, make it happen. If you want to say it in Latin, say it in Latin. Make sure it's right. I think it's right. Signs emptor. But thank you for tolerating us.
Thank you.